Opening the center establishes immediate influence, aiming for piece development and potentially quick central pawn advances to gain space. Developing the knight centrally establishes a strong presence and prepares for future pawn breaks, influencing the pawn structure's dynamic. Asserting central control, c4 prepares to contest the d5 square and launch a pawn storm on the queen side. By opening the bishop's diagonal and preparing castling, black solidifies the center and invites a rich positional struggle. Fortifying the center, this knight prepares for further central expansion and develops a piece harmoniously. Establishing central presence, black contests the d4 square directly and prepares to develop their queenside. Reinforcing the center, this develops another piece and prepares for central pawn pushes. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares to develop the bishop to its most active square. Pinning the knight disrupts black's central pawn structure and forces a decision about how to resolve the immediate tactical pressure. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the queen's bishop creates a resilient pawn structure. Unlocking the c-file now is a bold decision, potentially leading to immediate exchanges and simplifying the pawn structure. Recapturing on d5 solidifies black's central pawn structure, offering a solid foundation for piece development and preparing to challenge white's queenside initiative. Solidifying the center's structure, preparing for piece development and potential central pawn advances. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for castle becomes the priority, preventing any immediate kingside threats. Safeguarding the queen and preparing for queenside expansion, this move subtly pressures black's central pawn structure. Securing the king offers immediate peace of mind and prepares for any central action. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing for castling and potential kingside expansion. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers immediate counterplay and prepares for a potential exchange to ease pressure. Securing the castled king by tucking it away enhances defensive solidity, preparing for future central maneuvering. Refocusing the knight to the kingside aims to support a future g5 push and counter white's central pressure. Centralizing the rook unlocks attacking potential and improves piece coordination on the open files. A subtle central consolidation, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially launch a queenside expansion. A bold knight repositioning, this knight aims to control central squares and potentially create tactical imbalances. Reclaiming the knight's central influence addresses the cramped piece activity, preparing for a potential kingside pawn push or a repositioning to the queenside. Exchanging the bishop clarifies the central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the rook while relinquishing white's powerful attacking piece. Reclaiming the e7 square with the rook opens up potential for future central pawn advances and reestablishes material balance. White aggressively challenges black's queenside pawn structure, aiming for a space advantage and potential breakthroughs with the f-pawn. Challenging white's knight on e5, this move liberates black's knight and prepares for potential central counterplay. Recentralizing the knight after the pawn push aims to reinforce the d4 pawn and prepare for further central action. The rook now eyes the open c-file, an active outpost to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. Shifting the pawn structure, white boldly probes the weakened kingside, seeking to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop. Releasing the pinned knight from d7 opens a critical diagonal for the queen, potentially forcing white to defend their central pawns. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to pry open the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses around black's monarch for a future assault. Breaking the central pawn chain and challenging white's spatial advantage creates dynamic play. Aggressively staking claim to the queen's flank, this maneuver sharpens the focus on the d-file and eyes potential breakthroughs while temporarily ignoring king's safety. Challenging white's queenside expansion, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's central control and open attacking avenues. Hoping to spark an attack on the kingside, but it opens up the e-file for black's rook. Gaining queenside space here opens up avenues for counterplay against white's center. Anchoring this flank solidifies the pawn structure, anticipating black's queenside expansion. A provocative challenge to white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to seize initiative. A cautious repositioning, the knight abandons the promising central square to solidify its defensive posture and prepare for a potential kingside push later. Reinforcing the central struggle for the e-file, this rook arrives with intent, eyeing weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Anchoring the c-file offers robust defense against black's queenside expansion and prepares for potential advances on the kingside. Shifting the queen to d6 prepares for eventual counterplay on the queenside and reinforces the e-pawn. Repositioning the queen aims to enhance pressure on the queenside and potentially exploit weaknesses created by black's pawn structure. Swapping queens simplifies into an endgame where black's rook on the e-file is the dominant piece. Initiating pawn storm pressure on the queenside, the rook now claims an open file for future assaults. Opening the c-file for tactical possibilities, this decision challenges white's central pawn structure. Resuming central control and preparing for potential pawn pushes, white solidifies the center. Pushing the g-pawn weakens the kingside, inviting white's pieces into a newly created dark square outpost. Repositioning the rook aims to challenge the open file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Harnessing the knight's power, this repositions it for a central impact, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize initiative. Securing the queenside pawn chain allows white to consolidate and prepare for potential central expansion. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain queenside counterplay. Sharpening the kingside attack, this pawn advance aims to pry open lines for white's pieces. Gaining space on the queenside is a priority, but beware of creating weaknesses in your king's defense. Unlocking the queenside, Natu aims to reroute the knight, potentially supporting a later b4 push or improving its outpost status. This piece repositions to challenge white's queenside expansion and support a potential kingside pawn storm. Asserting central presence, the rook now cramps black's queenside maneuvering capabilities. King mobilization begins, seeking fresh avenues of activity before the queenside structure solidifies. Reinforcing the c-file, this anchors the rook, preparing for potential pressure against black's queenside structures. Opening the queenside flank to create dynamic play, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's solid structure. Snatching the pawn opens lines, but be mindful of potential counterplay on the queenside and your exposed king. Challenging the queenside flank with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's space and potentially open lines for counterplay. Seizing the open file, this capture opens lines for artillery while simultaneously solidifying the kingside pawn structure. Unleashing latent knight activity, this maneuver initiates a positional struggle for central control and potential infiltration. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank immediately creates substantial pressure on black's queenside pawns. Gaining a pawn on the queenside while weakening your kingside defense significantly. Securing the open file is paramount, preventing black from rerouting their rook and reinforcing the queenside. Shifting the rook behind the pawn chain offers a vital defensive shield, preparing to challenge the open file. The knight pivots to bolster the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential tactical skirmishes. Relocating the king allows it to escape the discovered attack and potentially reinforce the queenside pawn structure. Opening the file to the enemy king with this rook check will force tactical concessions. The black king's sanctuary is breached. Time to regroup and solidify defenses before the storm breaks. Securing the open file immediately forces black to consider their rook's safety and disrupts any potential counterplay. A tactical misstep that unnecessarily surrenders the open file, weakening the rook's defensive posture. Recapturing with the knight reroutes it towards the exposed black king. Exposing the king by forcing exchanges opens up mating possibilities. Opening the file with the rook instantly unleashes its power across the board. Repositioning the rook aims to create dynamic counterplay on the queen side, challenging white's piece activity. Seizing the open file immediately applies pressure, forcing the black king into a potentially compromised position.